History Class with Dr. W, and our continuing discussion of 1968. In the previous lecture, I talked about the Tet Offensive of January 1968. And in concluding that lecture, I talked about how the Tet Offensive was militarily a disastrous defeat for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, and in fact was a great victory for the Americans. In this lecture, though, we'll turn to a reflection of why and how that military victory for the Americans turned into one of its great defeats on the American home front and proved to be the decisive turning point of the entire war. How is it that the Americans managed to take this military victory and turn it into the greatest defeat of the war? And how and why did a moment that could have been the beginning of ultimate victory in Vietnam became in fact the turning point and the beginning of the end for American efforts there? Well, there are many reasons for this, one of which is that the attack came as a complete shock to the American people. As noted in some of my previous lectures, they had been told and reassured for years by Lyndon Johnson and William Westmoreland and others that the United States was winning the war, that the enemy was weakening, and that they might surrender at any time. It was clear in the aftermath of Tet that that was not the case. Even worse, the battles in many cases were shown on television in America. The battle for the American embassy, while quick and decisive, appeared desperate and panicked. One memorable moment occurred on February 2nd, 1968, when a chief of police for the South Vietnamese executed a Viet Cong terrorist in the streets, shooting him in the head, right in front of American cameras. This is one of the most memorable and horrible images of the entire war, and it's hard to convince ourselves that the man pulling the trigger is one of the good guys, one of America's allies, while the man being shot, who appears completely innocent, is actually the enemy. It was also after one of the battles of Tet, at the town of Ben Tre, that Air Force Major Chester Brown uttered the phrase that became one of the most memorable of the entire war, when he said, "It became necessary to destroy the town to save it." The conundrum that only in destroying South Vietnam could we save it was becoming less acceptable to many Americans at home. That phrase was one of the catchphrases of the anti-war movement for the duration of the war. Americans naturally had to question what was going on. As the prominent American newsman Walter Cronkite asked one night, "What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war." Lyndon Johnson's efforts to reassure the American people after Tet didn't have much effect. The credibility gap sealed his fate. We wondered if we could trust the president before. Now we knew we couldn't. So even though it does seem that increasing the pressure after Tet might have led to defeat of the North, the American people didn't believe him. Some of Johnson's advisors urged him to widen the war even more at that point. The Joint Chiefs wanted to escalate the bombing campaign in the North. But Johnson was racked with indecision. He had wider issues to be thinking about as well. The Cold War was heating up in other areas of the world. Korea, Berlin, and the Middle East all were points of contention in early 1968. And we'll be talking soon in this course about many other areas of the world that were being racked by all kinds of chaos at that point in time. American forces were stretched to the limit in Vietnam, and America had few resources to dedicate to these other issues around the rest of the world. Expanding the war even further in Vietnam would yet again require dramatic increases in the war effort and further increases to maintain American reserves and forces elsewhere. This was a crucial time in the course of the war. In February 1968, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Army General Earl Wheeler, encouraged General Westmoreland to request more troops for Vietnam, partly to shore up American troop strength around the world. Westmoreland agreed, asking for an additional 206,000 troops, even as the siege at Quezon was coming to an end. The troop request was delivered to Lyndon Johnson on February 28, 1968. To make the request seem even more urgent to shore up needs elsewhere in the world, Wheeler downplayed the successes of Tet and painted a negative picture of the situation. He hoped to pressure Johnson into providing the troops, but ultimately it backfired. The negative assessment opened up a debate in the Johnson administration that ultimately turned the direction of the entire war. Even some of the old reliable hawks of the Johnson administration began to balk at this point. Robert McNamara urged against sending even more troops, instead improving American recruitment for South Vietnamese troops and letting them fight the war. Lyndon Johnson was in a tough spot. He couldn't send such a large number of troops without activating the reserves and increasing the draft, and probably having to approach Congress for permission and perhaps a declaration of war. At the same time, he didn't want to alert anyone that he had reached his limits in willingness to wage war, especially if the troop requests became public, as they eventually did. Lyndon Johnson asked his new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, to put together a study group of the troop request. Clark Clifford was a longtime stalwart in the Democratic Party. He had been Truman's campaign manager in 1948 when he won the dramatic election over Dewey, that some of you might recall, the infamous Dewey defeats Truman headlines in the papers. He had been an advisor of John F. Kennedy and an informal advisor to Lyndon Johnson prior to being appointed Secretary of Defense to replace McNamara. Clifford had already begun to doubt the direction of the war. He was uncertain that the domino theory was a valid reason for fighting the war. In September 1967, in traveling to Asia, he discussed the idea with leaders in Thailand, the Philippines, South Korea, Australia, and elsewhere, and found none of them concerned that defeat in Vietnam would lead to revolution in their countries. Clifford discussed the troop request with many influential people. Governors and local officials, businessmen and lawyers, all were concerned with further escalation of the war. Clifford eventually formed a task force, including several of the senior advisors to the president, Dean Rusk, National Security Advisor Walt Rostow, General Wheeler, and others. This task force raised fundamental questions about the direction of the war, and went beyond just asking about the immediate troop request. They asked things like, will the additional troops win the war? If not, how many more? There was no answer. Would the enemy respond with more troops? Probably. How much would this cost? Some $2 billion a month. What about increased bombings? This was not likely to change the outcome of the war. Clifford was astonished at the failure of American strategy. Here are some of his words. I could not find out when the war was going to end. I could not find out the manner in which it was going to end. I could not find out whether the new requests for men and equipment were going to be enough, or whether it would take more, and if more, how much. I could not find out how soon the South Vietnamese forces would be ready to take over. All I had was the statement, given with too little self-assurance to be comforting, that if we persisted for an indeterminate length of time, the enemy would choose not to go on. And so I asked, does anyone see the diminution in the will of the enemy after 4 years of our having been there, after enormous casualties, and after massive destruction from our bombing? The answer was that there appeared to be no diminution in the will of the enemy. Clifford's task force concluded that the United States should not agree to the troop requests, and additionally, as he said, should level off our involvement and work towards gradual disengagement. Clifford delivered his report on March 4th. The president contemplated the report for several days. Others encouraged him to escalate the war and strike even harder. In the middle of his contemplation, on March 10th, 2 New York Times reporters, Hedrick Smith and Neil Sheehan, broke the story that Johnson was considering sending an additional 206,000 troops. The White House denied the story, but it quickly became impossible for Lyndon Johnson to send the troops. Public outrage and confusion was obvious. If we've just won this great victory, how could we possibly need another 200,000 troops? Even traditional hawks in Congress seemed to be backing away from the further commitment. The Tet Offensive had elevated the war once again to a major political issue, one to be discussed and debated. Heightening the pressure was the fact that 1968 was a presidential election year, and the war became the single most important issue. Lyndon Johnson was up for re-election in 1968. Prior to Tet, his position as the Democratic nominee had been little in doubt. Public opinion was still on his side, and he still had the support of his party. But in the New Hampshire primary, on March 12th, Lyndon Johnson found that he barely eked out a victory over a little-known senator from Minnesota, Eugene McCarthy. McCarthy had no money, no organization, and only one platform. He was opposed to the war. In the New Hampshire primary, McCarthy came within 500 votes of beating Lyndon Johnson, the sitting president. It was clear, not that McCarthy was a bona fide candidate, but that the public was ready to vote for someone other than Lyndon Johnson. 4 days later, a much more significant candidate joined the mix, New York Senator Robert Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson now knew that the presidential race would be long and difficult after that. At the same time, public opinion polls showed Lyndon Johnson at his lowest approval ratings yet. On top of all this, there were disturbing reports about the economy. The dollar was declining. War spending was leading to inflation. There was concern that sending additional troops might send the economy into a tailspin, as it seemed certain such a commitment would require additional expenses and probably taxes. On March 17th and 18th, Lyndon Johnson gave speeches attacking his critics and defending his war policies. The speeches were not well received, and his poll numbers did not improve. Meantime, his advisors and the so-called wise men urged him to deny the troop increase and try to scale back the war effort. On March 24th, though not yet publicly, Lyndon Johnson approved a troop increase of only 13,500. This would be the last increase of American military manpower committed to the war. At the same time, recruitment efforts for South Vietnamese troops increased as they announced they would be adding 135,000 more troops. Also, Lyndon Johnson recalled General Westmoreland. While some felt he was dismissed or this was an insult, actually Johnson had approved of his leadership and considered his new appointment as the Army Chief of Staff in Washington a promotion. The new commander in Vietnam was to be General Creighton W. Abrams, Westmoreland's deputy. But on the other hand, recalling Westmoreland sent the message that the man who had continually requested more troops in Vietnam was gone. Someone else had been put in charge. There would be no more escalation. On March 26th, Lyndon Johnson had a lengthy lunch meeting with many of his advisors and the wise men. The same men who had guided him down a road of escalation now abandoned him. They all urged him to pursue a policy of de-escalation and trying to get out. As Lyndon Johnson said bitterly after the meeting, "The establishment bastards have bailed out." For the next few days, Johnson worked on a major speech to be delivered on March 31st. It would become one of the true bombshell speeches in presidential history. On Sunday evening, March 31st, Lyndon Johnson appeared on television from the Oval Office. He appeared weary, as he was. The speech included 4 major announcements. One was the repeated offer of peace negotiations to North Vietnam, as well as a temporary stoppage in the bombings for North Vietnam to consider. The second announced that only 13,500 troops would be sent, rejecting the request for more. The United States effort in Vietnam from that point on would be focused on improving the military capabilities of South Vietnam's armed forces. But the fourth and final announcement is the one that everyone remembers. He said, "I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office. Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." Johnson's announcement was a shocker, but he had considered it for some time. He was concerned about his own health and worried that he wouldn't live out a second term. With McCarthy's success and Kennedy's candidacy, he knew that the campaign would be grueling, and he truly didn't have the energy for it. He also knew an even more difficult campaign lay ahead against Richard Nixon, the likely Republican candidate. 3 days later, Hanoi indicated its readiness for peace talks, which were scheduled for May 13th. On April 14th, the Pentagon officially denied Westmoreland's troop request and announced the ceiling 549,500 U.S. troop deployment in South Vietnam. It felt for all the world like American involvement in Vietnam might be coming to an end. Yet as we now know, American efforts in Vietnam lingered on for another full 5 years, and the war itself didn't end for about 7 years. America's continued involvement sparked even further protest on the home front, which became one of the hallmarks of 1968, something we'll talk much more about. In our next lecture, we'll turn to the American presidential election and talk much more about the various candidates, primaries, and the electoral process itself.